Okay, let's just jump right in. Today, we are doing an explainer on a fascinating, highly engaged right-wing media broadcast, and it's one that predicts a massive, long-lasting conservative wave. We're going to look really closely at this piece of source material, a passionate broadcast from a conservative commentator who actually lays out a super-specific, multi-layered blueprint for absolute Republican dominance. Now remember, we aren't here to take political sides, not at all. Our goal is simply to map out exactly what this commentator is arguing, how he uses data to back it all up, and what this strategy could look like on the ground for you, the voter.
So to really wrap our heads around these wide-ranging arguments, we've structured the broadcast into 5 key strategic pillars: the electoral map advantage, shifting voter demographics, purging the Republican Party, capitalizing on Democratic missteps, and finally, Trump's economic proposals. Let's see how this 20-year blueprint comes together.
The ultimate stakes here? They're absolutely fascinating. The host is literally banking on a 12 to 20-year era of conservative dominance. He's not just talking about winning the next election cycle, you know? He is passionately predicting a fundamental realignment of American politics. He even compares it to historical periods where Democrats held the House for 40 straight years. His entire broadcast is about building the foundation for this massive, specific, generational shift. I mean, if this blueprint plays out, the political landscape as we know it is going to look completely different for decades.
All right, moving right into pillar number 1, the electoral map advantage. We're going to see how the host claims institutional and legal changes will fundamentally alter the map before a single ballot is even cast.
The source broadcast points to some really aggressive federal enforcement of redistricting in red states. And the host calculates this will essentially mathematically lock out Democratic opposition. He cites recent Supreme Court rulings about racially gerrymandered districts. According to him, the Justice Department's enforcement is going to pressure Republican-led states to quickly redraw their maps. And get this, he estimates this action could shift anywhere from 10 to 19 House seats directly to the GOP. For him, this isn't just some boring legal update, it's a structural weapon. It totally redefines who has the power to pass the laws that affect your daily life.
And that leads directly into the commentator's core grievance. He cites a Heritage Foundation report alleging that census errors actually robbed red states of congressional representation and electoral votes. The source claims that because 8 blue states were overcounted and 6 red states, places like Florida, were undercounted, the Republican Party was essentially cheated out of their rightful power. So, looking ahead to the next census, the host argues that simply correcting this math is naturally going to hand conservatives even more structural power in the Electoral College and the House.
Okay, transitioning to Pillar 2, shifting voter demographics. The commentator pivots here from that institutional math right down to grassroots demographics. Because, it's one thing to draw lines on a map, but you still need actual voters to fill those districts.
Here, the host leans really heavily on recent polling data, specifically analyzed by CNN's Harry Enton, to suggest that the traditional Democratic coalition is actually fracturing. The commentator is completely thrilled by this analysis. He views it as absolute proof that the conservative message is finally breaking through demographic walls that have stood solid for over 60 years. For voters, well, this implies a total upheaval in how campaigns might target different communities moving forward.
Now, looking at the specific shift, moving from 12% approval among black voters in his first term up to 16% currently, the host argues this is going to have major ramifications, especially for tight Southern elections. Now, he does acknowledge that the vast majority of black voters still lean heavily Democratic, but he insists that a 4% climb for a Republican candidate, that's a massive statistical anomaly. In razor-thin races in places like Georgia, he argues this incremental trend is literally all it takes to tip the scales completely in favor of the GOP.
Which brings us to Pillar 3, purging the Republican Party. The crucial point here is how the host demands incredibly strict ideological discipline within his own ranks. Because A, you can't execute a 20-year plan if your own team isn't on the exact same page, right? Now, before we go any further, we need to define the term rhino, because the host uses this a lot to justify aggressively primarying moderate Republicans to enforce party loyalty. It stands for Republican in name only. The commentator has absolutely zero tolerance for moderates who might try to compromise with the left. He firmly insists that establishing a lasting conservative wave means you have to ruthlessly vote out these perceived rhinos during primary elections, basically ensuring that only fully committed, MAGA-aligned candidates ever reach the general election ballot.
But despite his really combative rhetoric, the host proposes what is actually a super pragmatic strategy. It's basically purge the moderates early, but ultimately vote strictly down party lines no matter what. He explicitly warns his audience against accelerationism, that idea of letting a Democrat win just to punish a moderate Republican. Nope.
Even if a voter absolutely despises the moderate Republican on the ticket, the commentator insists they just have to swallow their pride and vote for them anyway, because keeping the opposition out of power, that is the absolute top priority.
Moving on to number 4, capitalizing on Democratic missteps. Let's dive into how the commentator translates his disdain for the political left into real strategic advantages on the campaign trail.
The host expresses some extreme ideological polarization here. He argues there's absolutely no room for compromise, and then Democratic missteps provide, well, basically endless fuel for Republican momentum. For example, he points to government shutdowns over funding for ICE, immigration and customs enforcement, as total political failures for the left. And this is fascinating. He cites an NBC poll claiming that ICE actually polls higher in popularity than the Democratic Party itself. Crazy, right? He uses this as proof that the opposition has completely alienated moderate voters, leaving this massive open lane for a conservative sweep. And finally, Pillar 5, Trump's economic proposals. Let's explore the granular economic policies being used to attract new voters to this coalition. It's not all just culture wars. There are very precise financial pitches here that could directly impact your wallet. The commentator enthusiastically supports economic policies that directly target political rivals. He frames the idea of ending student loans for liberal arts degrees as just plain common sense. He points out that taxpayers spend roughly $60 billion a year on degrees that, in his view anyway, lose money and offer no real skills, especially now in the age of AI. So by proposing to cut off federal funding for what he calls junk degrees, the policy aims to save young people from crippling debt while simultaneously defunding the educational institutions that the host views as politically hostile.
Now, stepping away from higher education for a second, the source details a surprisingly specific federal IRA matching program, and this is aimed at bypassing the Social Security system to build generational wealth. The host essentially sees Social Security as a failing Ponzi scheme, so to replace it without triggering some massive political battle, he champions an executive order proposal. This would create low-cost individual retirement accounts for workers who don't have employer plans. It requires zero employer participation and provides up to a $1,000 federal match for low-income earners.
To really hammer home the theoretical appeal of this policy, the host projects that a 25-year-old investing just $165 a month under this matching plan, they'd amass a staggering $465,000 by age 65. I mean, the commentator views this as an absolute game changer. It represents a total shift from that old-school libertarian view of zero government intervention to this new populist approach, actually using the levers of government to help everyday workers build real wealth, and by doing so, securing their political loyalty for generations to come.
Bringing the whole shebang together, the source concludes that this grand strategic vision fails completely. Falls totally flat, unless the Republican base turns out in massive numbers, like right now. The host severely warns his audience not to get complacent. All those demographic shifts, all the redistricting math, the clever economic policies, they mean absolutely nothing if voters don't actually show up in the midterms to set the stage for the pivotal 2028 election.
So as we wrap up this explainer, it leaves us with a really fascinating question. Can this specific combination of targeted redistricting, demographic chipping, and new economic policies actually realign American politics for the next 2 decades? The commentator has definitely laid out a highly structured, highly confident roadmap, but whether or not reality is going to conform to this exact blueprint, well, that's something only time and the voters will decide. Thanks so much for joining me as we unpack this source material and keep questioning the strategies shaping our world.